She had spent 6 years answering the same question in different rooms, from different people in different tones. Where is their father? She always gave the same answer. He doesn't know. What she never said out loud was the other half of that sentence, because I never let him find out. 3 children, 1 wedding invitation she never received, and a promise she made to herself the night she left his family's house that she would never again stand in a room where she had to prove she belonged there. Her name was Grace Monroe, and for 6 years she had kept that promise. Until the morning her youngest asked her a question she could no longer answer with a lie. Nobody in that ballroom expected the doors to open before the ceremony started. Nobody expected 3 small faces to walk in ahead of her, faces that looked so much like the groom standing at the altar that the entire room went quiet before a single word was spoken. His name was Ryan Whitfield. The bride noticed first. Her name was Olivia Hart, and she had spent 2 years being told by everyone around her that she was marrying a good man from a good family. Then the mother of the groom noticed, a woman named Alina Whitfield, who had spent 6 years insisting that Ryan's past was handled, finished, closed for good. And then Ryan himself looked at the 3 children the way a man looks at a debt he thought he would never have to pay. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Grace had not come to ruin anything. She told herself that the entire flight there, sitting beside the one man who had never once asked her for anything in return for what he gave her. She had come because her children had asked her one question too many times, and she had run out of ways to protect them from a truth by keeping it locked away in a drawer she rarely opened, even for herself. To understand how she ended up standing in that doorway, in a dress she had not planned to wear to anyone's wedding but her own, it helps to go back to where all of it began. 6 years earlier, in a university library on a Tuesday afternoon that neither of them expected to remember for the rest of their lives. Grace Monroe grew up in a small town in Georgia, the daughter of a school teacher and a construction worker who believed that education was the one inheritance no one could ever take from her. She arrived at college on a partial scholarship, working 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship did not, and she had a habit, when she was overwhelmed, of staring at the same page of a textbook for far longer than the material required. That was exactly how Ryan Whitfield found her, in a corner of the library 3 weeks before his economics final, when he noticed a young woman who had not turned a page in 40 minutes. He did not know her name yet. He only knew that something about the stillness in her posture looked less like studying and more like drowning quietly in plain sight. He sat down across from her without asking permission, which she would later tell him was either the most confident or the most reckless thing a stranger had ever done in front of her. He asked which section of the material was giving her trouble. She told him, a little sharply, that she did not need help. He told her that he had not offered pity, only a study partner, and that she could take it or leave it. She took it. What began as one evening of quizzing each other on supply curves and interest rates became 2 evenings a week, then 4, then most days, until neither of them could remember whose idea it had originally been. Ryan was, by every outward measure, the kind of young man whose future had already been written for him before he was born. His family's name sat on buildings across 3 states. His mother had a plan for every stage of his life, from the university he attended to the woman she expected him to marry, and Ryan had spent 22 years mostly going along with it, telling himself that comfort and obligation were close enough to happiness that the difference did not matter. Grace was the first person who ever asked him, directly, whether the life he was living actually belonged to him. He did not have a good answer. That question became the real beginning of their relationship, long before either of them called it love out loud. Their courtship unfolded the way most quiet, real ones do, in small moments rather than grand ones. He learned that she took her coffee black because she refused to spend money on cream when rent was due. She learned that he had never once, in his entire life, been told no by someone who did not also want something from him in return. They built a private language out of study sessions and long walks after the library closed, and somewhere in the second year, Ryan began talking about a future that included her without quite realizing he had started doing it. He described a house with a garden. He described children filling it with enough noise that the walls never felt quiet. Grace, who had learned early to be careful with her hope, let herself believe him anyway. It was Grace who first spoke about what she wanted to build with her own life, separate from him. She wanted to open a school, not the kind with polished lobbies and waiting lists, but one for adults who had fallen through the cracks of formal education, people like her own father, who had left school at 12 to support his family and never had the chance to go back. Ryan listened to her describe that dream the way other men listen to business proposals, with real attention, and told her that whatever she built, he wanted to be standing beside her when she built it. It was the first time in his life he had wanted something that had nothing to do with the legacy his mother kept reminding him he was responsible for carrying forward. 2 years into their relationship, Ryan asked Grace to come home with him to meet his family. She hesitated. She had heard things about Whitfield, about the standards she held for anyone who came near her son, standards that had little to do with kindness and everything to do with what a person's presence said about the family's reputation. Ryan promised her it would be fine, that his mother's reputation was worse than the reality, and that he would be standing beside her the entire evening no matter what was said. Grace agreed to go, on the condition that if the evening went badly, he would not ask her to pretend otherwise just to keep the peace. He gave her his word. It was a promise he would break within the hour. Whitfield greeted Grace at the door with a smile that did not reach her eyes and a string of questions that sounded polite on the surface and felt, to Grace, like an interview for a position she had not applied for. Where does your family come from? What do your parents do for work? What exactly are you studying? And what do you intend to do with it? Grace answered every question honestly, telling about her mother's classroom and her father's decades on construction sites, about her plan to build a school for adults who never had the chance to finish their own education. Called it admirable, in a tone that made the word sound smaller than it should have. Later that evening, while Grace stepped outside for air, she overheard speaking to Ryan in the dining room. She heard say that kindness was a wonderful quality in a woman, but that kindness alone did not build a legacy, and that a Whitfield man had a responsibility to be thoughtful about what his choices said about where the family was going. She heard no response from Ryan at all, only silence, the kind of silence that told her everything she needed to know about where he stood when it actually mattered. When she told him what she had heard, he tried to explain it away, telling her his mother was simply protective, that it would take time, that it did not mean anything. Grace pointed out gently but firmly that he had been standing right there and had said nothing in her defense. He admitted that he should have. It was the first crack in a foundation neither of them wanted to look at too closely. Despite that evening, their relationship continued to grow. A year later, on an evening that had nothing rehearsed about it, Ryan asked Grace to marry him, telling her that he did not want to keep talking about their future as though it were something distant, that he wanted to start building it with her immediately. She said yes. They spent the following weeks looking at rings and planning a small, honest wedding, one built around the marriage itself rather than a performance for an audience. Grace made him promise that whatever the wedding day looked like, the marriage underneath it would be the only thing that actually mattered. He promised her that without hesitation. For a while, it seemed like the family's disapproval might simply fade into the background, overpowered by two people who had decided together what their life was going to look like. That fragile peace did not last. During a family dinner meant to celebrate the engagement, raised a subject neither Ryan nor Grace had prepared for. She asked, in front of the entire table, how much thought they had given to children and how soon they intended to start a family. Grace explained that they were still in the early stages of planning the wedding itself. Alina responded that planning a wedding and planning a family were two entirely different matters, and that the Whitfield name did not continue through conversations. It continued through children, born into a family that was intentional and prepared. She suggested, not as a request but as an expectation, that the couple undergo fertility testing before the wedding, framing it as the responsible thing to do, better to know early than to be surprised later. Grace asked Ryan directly whether he believed they actually needed the testing, or whether his mother had simply planted the idea and he had repeated it because it was easier than pushing back. Ryan admitted that his mother had a point, that if there was something either of them should know medically, before building a family together, it made sense to know it now rather than later. Grace agreed to the testing on one condition, that whatever the results showed for either of them, they would face it together, as equals, not as one partner being examined and found acceptable or unacceptable by the other's family. Ryan promised her that. It was a promise that would prove far harder to keep than either of them anticipated once the results came back. The appointment itself was clinical and unremarkable, two people sitting side by side answering questions about their medical history, while a doctor took notes. It was the days that followed, waiting for results neither of them had asked for in the first place, that revealed exactly how much pressure Alina's involvement had already placed on a relationship that had, until recently, felt unbreakable to both of them. Grace found herself wondering, for the first time, whether the family she was marrying into would ever see her as anything other than a variable to be measured and evaluated against a standard she had never agreed to be held to. When the results came back, the doctor explained them carefully to both of them together, exactly as Grace had asked. There were complications on both sides, difficulties that would make conception more challenging but not impossible for either of them. The doctor was clear that many couples in similar circumstances went on to build families, with patience, monitoring, and the right medical support. Grace left that appointment believing, naively, that the shared nature of the results would settle the matter once and for all, that there was no longer any question of blame, because both of them carried some version of the same difficulty. She was wrong. Within days, Alina appeared at their apartment unannounced, having heard secondhand that the results were less than perfect. She asked Ryan directly what the doctor had said, ignoring Grace almost entirely as though the conversation did not concern her at all. When Ryan explained that the challenges existed on both sides, that it was not a problem belonging to Grace alone, Alina said, in front of both of them, that a Whitfield man needed a woman who could secure the future of the family, and that a woman who could not do that was not a risk she could support her son taking. Grace pointed out that no one had said anything was falling apart, that they had walked out of the doctor's office that same morning still processing the information themselves, and that Alina was already deciding what it meant before either of them had a chance to. Ryan said nothing. Grace turned to him and asked him to say something, anything, in her defense. He told her only that his mother was worried about the family. It was the second time he had chosen silence over her, and this time, the silence lasted far longer than one evening. For the following week, Ryan grew distant, avoiding real conversation, hiding behind work and obligation. When Grace finally confronted him, demanding that he tell her what he was actually feeling rather than what sounded acceptable to his mother, he asked her a question that cut deeper than anything Alina had said directly to her face. He asked what would happen if she never gave him children at all. Grace reminded him that she had stayed by his side through every difficult season of his own life, and that his question, after everything, felt like an accusation dressed up as fear. He apologized, but the apology arrived only after the damage had already been done. Grace told him quietly that perhaps it was better to end things now than to waste more years on a foundation that had never truly been solid to begin with. Ryan did not stop her from walking out that night. He stood at the window and watched her go, and he said nothing at all. What Ryan did not know, and would not learn for 6 years, was that Grace left his family's house that week already carrying more than a broken engagement. She discovered, several weeks later, that she was pregnant, and not with one child but with 3. She sat alone in a doctor's office, staring at an ultrasound screen showing 3 separate heartbeats, and felt an entire future rearrange itself around her without her permission. She told the doctor she was completely alone with the news. The doctor asked gently whether there was anyone in her life who could offer support through what would be classified as a high-risk pregnancy. Grace said she would figure it out, that she always did, though even she did not fully believe it in that moment. She did not tell Ryan. She told herself in the beginning that it was because she did not want to hand Alina Whitfield the satisfaction of being right about her all along. Later, she would admit to herself that it was also fear of watching Ryan choose his mother's approval over her one more time, this time with 3 children as the stakes instead of just her own heart. She moved through the following months quietly, working as long as her body allowed, telling almost no one the full truth of her situation, determined to prove, mostly to herself, that she did not need anyone's permission or protection to raise a family on her own terms. It was a chance encounter on a city sidewalk that changed the direction of everything. Grace, several months into her pregnancy, exhausted and pale, nearly stumbled off a curb before a familiar voice caught her. It belonged to Daniel Cole, a man she had known since college, someone she had once helped through the hardest academic crisis of his life, staying up 2 nights in a row to help him prepare an appeal after he had been failed by an unfair committee decision. Daniel had never forgotten that. He took one look at her, pale and swaying and holding a bag with prenatal vitamins inside it, and refused to let her walk away without sitting down first. Daniel learned over the course of that conversation that Grace was carrying triplets, that the father was not involved, and that she had been managing entirely on her own for months. He did not offer pity, and he did not call what he wanted to do charity, a word Grace rejected the moment he suggested it. He reminded her that she had once shown up for him when no one else had, without asking for anything in return, and told her that showing up for her now was simply the same debt being repaid in the other direction. He offered her a place to stay in his home, no conditions attached, until she found her footing. Grace, who had spent months refusing help out of pride, finally accepted, telling herself it would only be temporary. Daniel's house became the first place in months where Grace felt she could breathe without bracing for judgment. He made it clear to everyone in his household that she was to be treated with the same respect given to him, not similar respect the same, and that if she needed anything, she was to be helped before anyone else in the house was. He arranged for her to see a specialist who handled high-risk pregnancies, insisting that a triplet pregnancy required a level of medical monitoring that a general practitioner could not provide. He drove her to every appointment personally, and when the doctor explained the risks, preterm labor, elevated blood pressure, uneven growth between the 3 bobbies, Daniel listened as carefully as if the outcome were his own to carry. Grace often asked him why he made it look so easy to simply open his home and his resources to someone with no clear way to repay him. Daniel told her it was because doing the right thing was usually the simplest thing in the world, if a person did not let fear complicate it. She did not fully understand what he meant by that until months later, when preterm labor arrived 8 weeks early, and Daniel was the one who kept his composure long enough to get her to the hospital in time, staying in the waiting room through the entire delivery, praying with a stranger beside him for the survival of 3 children who were not his own. All 3 children were born small but breathing, and in the hours after their birth, a nurse found Daniel in the waiting room and told him that Mother and Bobby's were stable. He walked into the room where Grace lay exhausted and asked her to say something. She told him only that after everything the world had put her through in the previous year, this was still, somehow, the strongest and most complete she had ever felt. Daniel told her that whatever strength had carried her through that delivery, it belonged entirely to her, and that he had simply had the privilege of standing nearby while she did it. Grace named her children Noah, Ava, and Lily, and the four of them, along with Daniel, who had by then become a permanent and irreplaceable presence in their lives, settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, very much like a family. The children grew up calling him Uncle Daniel, a title he never tried to expand beyond its boundaries, even as the boundaries grew thinner with each passing year. He built furniture with his own hands rather than buying it, answered every strange question a curious 3-year-old could invent, and never once made Grace feel as though her exhaustion or her grief were burdens he resented carrying alongside her. There were nights, watching her put 3 children to bed with more patience than most people could summon for one, when Daniel understood that what he felt for Grace had grown into something far beyond gratitude or old debts repaid. He waited years before he said anything, not wanting to complicate a life that had already been complicated enough by people who claimed to love her and failed to show it. When he finally did propose, on an ordinary evening after the children had fallen asleep, he told her plainly that he was not asking out of pity or obligation, that he saw her clearly, every day, and chose her deliberately, and wanted to keep doing that with a name behind it. Grace turned him down, though not because she doubted his character or his devotion. She told him she could not marry him out of gratitude, even a gratitude so deep it sometimes felt indistinguishable from love in certain lights, because he deserved a woman who came to him whole, someone who chose him because he was the person she wanted, not because he happened to be the one who showed up when everyone else had disappeared. Daniel accepted her answer without resentment, telling her only that he was asking for a real chance, not asking her to pretend, just asking her to let him try. Something in Grace softened at those words, even as she held her answer steady. The door, she told him, was not closed. It simply was not the right time to open it. While Grace built a life with Daniel by her side in every way but marriage, Ryan Whitfield's life followed the path his mother had drawn for him long before Grace ever entered the picture. Eleanor told him repeatedly that what had happened with Grace had been the right decision, for him, for the family, for his future, and that grief over a woman who was never right for him was simply a waste of years he could spend building something more suitable. Eventually, worn down by years of that same message repeated at every family dinner, Ryan agreed to meet a woman named Olivia Hart, whose family Eleanor had personally vetted and approved. Olivia was, by every account, exceptional, intelligent, composed, and genuinely kind in her own right. Ryan proposed to Olivia within a year, telling himself, and eventually her, that he wanted to build something real and lasting. He never once mentioned Grace's name to her, not because he had forgotten, but because he had trained himself to treat the memory of her as a closed door he was no longer permitted to open. He kept an old photograph of Grace hidden away, and on the rare occasions Eleanor caught him looking at it, she told him plainly to put it away, that looking backward did nothing for a man with a future and a woman who had already said yes to him waiting in front of him. He listened to his mother. He always had. Olivia and Ryan underwent their own fertility testing before their wedding, a decision Eleanor encouraged just as forcefully as she had with Grace years earlier. When the results came back showing complications that would require support and patience, Ryan found himself sitting in a doctor's office for the second time in his life, receiving nearly identical news from a nearly identical seat. Olivia noticed how far away he seemed during that appointment and asked him directly what was wrong. For the first time, Ryan admitted the truth to someone new, that this exact conversation had happened before with someone else, years earlier, and that he had failed her completely when it mattered most. Olivia asked him what he had done differently this time. He told her only that he was sorry for both of them, though the apology answered very little. Meanwhile, in a different city, 3 curious children were beginning to notice a gap in their lives that other children's lives did not seem to have. Noah, Ava, and Lily attended school events where other children's fathers showed up, cheering from the sidelines or standing awkwardly near the snack table, and they began asking Grace, with increasing frequency, why they never had a father at those same events. Grace, who had rehearsed an honest but age-appropriate answer for years, finally sat all three of them down together and told them the truth in pieces they could understand, that she and their father had loved each other once, long before any of them were born, and that painful things had happened that caused her to leave and protect herself. The children pressed further, asking whether their father knew they existed at all. Grace admitted that he did not, that she had left before discovering she was pregnant, and that by the time she knew, she had already decided to build their life apart from him and his family. She told them she did not know whether their father wanted to know them now, but that she believed, more and more as they grew older, that they deserved the chance to find out for themselves rather than have that decision made permanently on their behalf by her alone. It was Ava, the most direct of the three, who asked her plainly whether Uncle Daniel was their real father. Grace watched Daniel answer honestly himself, telling them he was not their father, that a different man held that role, someone their mother had known before he came back into her life, but that his love for all three of them was not something that would ever change regardless of what they learned. That conversation settled something in Grace that had been unsettled for years. She told Daniel that she needed to find Ryan, not to reopen anything between the two of them, but because she could no longer look at her children's faces and continue protecting herself at their expense. Daniel, despite whatever complicated feelings he carried about the man who had once let Grace walk out into the world alone and pregnant, told her he supported the decision completely, and that he would be there when she returned, all of them, exactly as they were. Locating Ryan proved simple enough. His family's business had only grown more visible over the years, and it did not take long for Grace to learn that he had taken over leadership of the family company, and that his wedding to Olivia Hart was scheduled within a matter of weeks. Grace decided she did not want to wait until after the wedding to tell her children the truth, worried that waiting any longer would only deepen the wound of having carried the question for so long. She also made the decision, difficult as it was, that the children deserved to meet their father in person rather than through a phone call or a letter that could be easily dismissed or delayed. When she told Daniel her plan to bring all three children to the estate, he offered to arrange transportation immediately, insisting that a long car ride would only exhaust three anxious children before they even arrived. Grace initially resisted the offer, telling him it felt like too much, but Daniel reminded her gently that arriving with a clear head and calm children mattered more than her pride about accepting help one more time. On the flight, Grace tried to prepare her children for what they might find, though she admitted honestly that she did not know herself what kind of reception waited for them. Noah asked what they should call their father once they arrived. Ava asked what would happen if he did not want them at all. Grace told her daughter, without hesitation, that if that happened, they would simply come home together, and that they would be no worse off than they had been the day before, because what they already had as a family was already enough on its own. It was a promise she meant completely, even as her hands shook slightly during the entire flight down. They arrived at the estate on the exact morning of Ryan's wedding, a detail Grace had not planned but did not regret once she understood the timing could not be changed without losing her nerve entirely. Wedding preparations were already well underway when the four of them walked through the front doors uninvited, drawing the attention of staff, guests, and eventually the wedding party itself. It was Whitfield who first laid eyes on the three children standing beside Grace and understood, before anyone explained a single word, exactly whose faces she was looking at. Olivia noticed next, glancing between the children and her soon-to-be husband with a question forming on her face that she had not yet found the words to ask. Ryan turned from the altar and saw them standing in the doorway, three children who shared his features so unmistakably that denial was never going to be an option, standing beside the one woman his mother had spent 6 years insisting he was better off without. Lily, the youngest, asked the question that had started this entire journey months earlier, asking whether the man standing at the altar was the father they had come to find. Grace did not answer immediately. She simply let the silence in that room speak for itself. The same silence Ryan had once chosen over defending her, now turned back on him in front of every person who had gathered to celebrate a wedding that was no longer going to happen the way anyone in that room had planned. Olivia was the first to speak with any real composure. She told Ryan plainly that she was not devastated, only disappointed, that she deserved a man whose whole heart was actually present in the relationship, and that whatever unfinished business stood in that doorway had clearly been unfinished the entire 2 years they had spent together. She wished him well, told him she hoped he was finally brave enough to handle it properly, and walked away from the altar without raising her voice once. The remaining guests began to whisper among themselves, unsure whether to leave or stay, while Elena stood frozen near the front row, watching 6 years of careful denial collapse in front of an audience she had spent a lifetime trying to control. Ryan stepped down from the altar and approached his children slowly, aware that anything sudden might frighten 3 young people who had never met him before that morning. Noah asked him directly why he had never come looking for them. Ryan admitted, honestly and without excuse, that he had not known they existed, that Grace had left before discovering her pregnancy, and that he swore that truth to them completely. Ava pressed further, asking whether he had ever tried to find their mother again after she left. Ryan told her the harder truth, that he had not looked, that he had told himself it was better that way, and that he had been wrong every single day since then, carrying that decision quietly in the back of his mind without ever acting to correct it. Grace watched her children ask her questions of their own once the initial shock settled into something closer to conversation. She told them, gently but firmly, that these were their children, not a decision he could revisit whenever life became complicated again, and that if he intended to come into their lives, he needed to come in fully, showing up consistently, earning whatever trust they eventually chose to extend to him. Ryan agreed to every condition without hesitation, understanding, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that agreement without action meant nothing to 3 children who had already learned to expect disappointment from grown men who spoke in promises. Elena attempted to intervene, insisting that the family needed time to process the situation privately before making any decisions in front of an audience of guests and staff. Ryan, for the first time in his life, refused to defer to her. He told her plainly, in front of everyone still standing in that room, that his children had grown up without a father because of choices made inside that very house, choices he had allowed because he had been too proud and too afraid to push back against her. He told her the environment she had created, the pressure, the constant measuring of people's worth, the cruelty she dressed up as practical concern for the family's legacy, belonged to her, and that he intended to build a relationship with his children without asking for her approval or her input going forward. In the weeks that followed, Ryan made good on his promise to show up, though earning his children's trust proved far slower and more difficult than he had anticipated standing in that doorway. Micah, watchful and skeptical by nature, told him directly one evening that words meant very little from adults who had already shown they could disappear. Ryan agreed with him completely, telling his son that the only thing that would prove anything was whether he kept returning, week after week, without needing to be reminded or convinced. He began attending school events he had missed for years, learning each child's individual personality rather than treating them as a single unit, discovering that Ava asked endless questions about how things worked, that Noah preferred quiet conversation over loud enthusiasm, and that Lily noticed emotional undercurrents in a room long before anyone else did. Grace, watching this slow rebuilding happen, remained cautious about what it might mean for her own relationship with Ryan, separate from his relationship with the children. When he eventually asked her, carefully and without pressure, whether there was any future version where the two of them might find room to be something different from what they had been. She told him honestly that the door was not closed, but that she was not ready to open it, and that she had no timeline to offer him for when, or if, that might change. Ryan accepted her answer without argument, telling her only that he understood, and that whatever happened between them personally, his commitment to their children would remain exactly the same regardless of her decision. Daniel, watching all of this unfold from the sidelines of a life he had helped Grace rebuild from nothing, admitted privately to her that the situation was difficult in ways he did not fully have language for, even as he reaffirmed that his love for her had not changed and would not change regardless of how the situation resolved. Grace told him she needed to know that whatever happened next, the children would remain his to love as well, that nothing about their bond depended on the outcome of her uncertain relationship with Ryan. Daniel told her, without hesitation, that the children had never once been conditional in his heart, and that he intended to remain exactly what he had always been to them, regardless of what shape the rest of the family eventually took. Eleanor Whitfield's own reckoning arrived more slowly than her son, but it arrived nonetheless. Weeks after the wedding that never finished, she appeared at Grace's door, uninvited but visibly humbled, and told her that she had spent that time finally understanding the true weight of decisions she had once justified as practical concern for her family's legacy. She admitted that what she had done, framing a medical diagnosis as a character flaw, treating a young woman's worth as something to be measured against an arbitrary standard of suitability, had not been protection at all, but cruelty dressed up in the language of good sense. Grace told her honestly that she was not prepared to offer forgiveness on demand, that forgiveness had to be felt honestly rather than performed for the sake of smoothing over a difficult moment, but that she appreciated the honesty of the apology regardless of how long it had taken to arrive. Eleanor asked, cautiously, whether she might eventually be permitted to meet her grandchildren properly, understanding that the decision belonged entirely to Grace and to the children themselves rather than to her. Grace told her she would think about it, making no promises beyond that, and Eleanor accepted the answer with a grace of her own that surprised even Grace, who had spent years viewing her only as an obstacle rather than a person capable of change. It would take several more months, and several more small gestures of consistency rather than grand apologies, before that particular relationship began to soften into something resembling the start of trust. The children, for their part, adjusted to their new and expanding family in the way children often do, with more resilience and clarity than the adults around them managed to summon. Eden, once frightened by the idea of a father who might disappear again, eventually told Ryan directly that she was glad he loved them even during the months when nothing else about the situation felt certain. Ryan told her that his love for them was the one part of this entire complicated story that had never once been in question, and that everything else, the trust, the relationship with their mother, the slow rebuilding of a family that had been broken before it ever properly began, would simply take the time it needed to take. Grace continued raising her children alongside Daniel, whose steadiness never wavered even as the family around them grew more complicated with Ryan's continued presence. She often reflected, in quiet moments after the children had gone to bed, on how differently her life had unfolded from the plans she and Ryan had once made together in that university library, and how much stronger she had become by being forced to build an entirely different life out of what remained after those plans collapsed. She did not regret the years of struggle, because they had taught her a version of her own strength she might never have discovered otherwise, sitting comfortably inside a marriage that had been built more on obligation and family approval than genuine partnership. Ryan, for his part, continued the slow work of proving himself consistent, understanding that his children's trust could not be rushed or purchased through grand gestures, only earned through the accumulation of ordinary days spent actually showing up. He rebuilt his relationship with his mother as well, though on entirely different terms than before, refusing to allow her opinions to dictate decisions that belonged to him and his children alone. Eleanor, humbled by watching her son finally stand up to her, found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely listening rather than instructing. A change that surprised everyone in the family who had known her the longest. As for the question Ryan had once asked Grace, whether there might ever be room for something more between them, that question remained unresolved for a long while, neither fully closed nor fully open, exactly as Grace had told him it would be. She continued building the school she had once described to him in a university library years earlier, a place for adults who had fallen through the cracks of formal education, and she often noticed Ryan showing up quietly to help with logistics or funding, without asking for credit or attention in return. Whatever the future eventually held for the two of them personally, both of them understood, finally, that real love was never something that could be forced into a shape someone else had drawn in advance. It had to be built honestly, in the open, by people willing to choose each other again and again, without needing anyone else's approval to do it. Years later, when Noah, Ava, and Lily were old enough to understand the full shape of the story their family had lived through, Grace told them the entire truth without softening any of it: the cruelty, the silence, the years of struggle, but also the resilience, the friendship that had carried her through the hardest season of her life, and the slow, imperfect rebuilding that followed. She told them that the story was not a simple one with a single villain and a single happy ending, but a true one, full of people who had made real mistakes, and some of them had done the harder work of actually changing afterward. She told them that understanding both halves of that truth, the harm and the growth, was more valuable to them than any fairy tale version of events could ever be. Daniel remained, throughout all of it, exactly what he had always been: a steady presence who had never once needed the title of father to prove the depth of his love for 3 children who were not biologically his own. The children, as adults, would often say that whatever version of family they eventually understood love to mean, it had been shaped first by watching a man show up for people who had no obligation to repay him, simply because doing the right thing was, in his words, usually the simplest thing in the world, if a person did not let fear complicate it. Grace often thought back to the woman she had been at 20, staring blankly at the same page of a textbook for 40 minutes, waiting for someone to notice she was struggling. She would tell her own children, whenever the moment called for it, that the hardest seasons of a person's life rarely announce themselves clearly at the time, that they simply have to be walked through one difficult day after another, until eventually, if a person is patient and honest enough with themselves, they arrive somewhere on the other side that actually resembles peace. It had taken her the better part of a decade to arrive there herself. But she had arrived, whole, on her own terms, surrounded by 3 children who knew exactly who their mother was, and exactly what she had survived to raise them. 2 years after the wedding that never finished, Grace's school finally opened its doors, a modest building on the edge of the same neighborhood where she had grown up, with classrooms designed specifically for adults returning to education later in life than most. Her father, older now and slower on his feet, walked through the front hallway on opening day and told her quietly that this was the proudest he had ever been of anything in his entire life, prouder even than the day she had first left for college on a scholarship he had never fully believed she would win. Grace had built the entire project on the belief her father had planted in her as a child, that education was the one inheritance no one could ever take away. And standing in that hallway watching adult students walk in for their first classes, she understood that she had finally turned a private family value into something the wider world could benefit from as well. Ryan attended the opening quietly, near the back of the room, having offered financial support for the building's construction months earlier without asking for his name to appear anywhere on the plaque outside. When Grace noticed him there, She did not ask him to leave, and she did not make a show of acknowledging him either. It had become, by that point, an unspoken understanding between them that his support for what mattered to her did not require public recognition or a return to what they once were. Their children noticed him standing there too, and Ava, older now and more direct than ever, walked over and asked him plainly why he had never mentioned funding the building himself. Ryan told her honestly that some things were worth doing quietly, without needing anyone to know, a lesson he admitted he had learned far too late in life, and one he intended to keep practicing for the rest of it. Eleanor Whitfield attended as well, seated near the front at Grace's own invitation, a gesture that surprised everyone in the family, who remembered the woman she had been 6 years earlier. She had spent those 2 years slowly earning back a measure of trust through consistency rather than apology alone, showing up for school recitals and birthday celebrations without ever again attempting to insert her opinions about who the children should become or what their futures ought to look like. Lily, the youngest, had grown especially close to her grandmother during that time, often saying that Eleanor listened to her in a way she had never expected from the woman her mother once described, carefully, as someone who used to measure people rather than know them. Eleanor herself would later admit, in a rare, unguarded moment, that learning to listen rather than instruct had been the hardest and most necessary lesson of her later life. Daniel stood beside Grace throughout the opening ceremony, exactly where he had stood through nearly every significant moment of the previous 6 years. And when a local reporter asked Grace who the man beside her was, she answered without hesitation that he was family, a truth that required no further explanation to anyone who actually knew their story. Their relationship had continued to grow in the years following his proposal, slower and steadier than either of them had originally imagined, built on an honesty that neither of them had rushed. Grace had eventually told him, on an ordinary evening much like the one when he first asked her, that the door he once described as not yet ready to open had finally opened on its own, without either of them forcing it, and that she wanted to build the rest of her life with him, fully, as an equal partner rather than out of gratitude for everything he had already given her. Daniel married Grace the following spring. In a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, rather than the large performance Ryan and Olivia had once planned years earlier. Noah, Ava, and Lily stood beside their mother throughout the entire ceremony, and it was Noah who quietly told Daniel afterward that he did not need a title to be considered their father in every way that actually mattered, that the title, if he wanted it, was simply theirs to give him whenever he was ready to accept it. Daniel, a man rarely moved to visible emotion, admitted it was the first time in years he had needed a moment alone to compose himself before rejoining the celebration. Ryan's relationship with his children continued to deepen in the years that followed, built entirely on the quiet consistency he had promised them in that ballroom doorway years earlier. He never again asked Grace for more than she was willing to offer, understanding, finally, that some kinds of trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt through patient, ordinary effort rather than any single grand gesture. He remained close with all 3 of his children into their adult lives, present at graduations, celebrations, and the quiet, unremarkable Tuesday evenings that ultimately mattered more than any of the dramatic moments that had brought their family into being in the first place. When people asked him, years later, what he had learned from the story of his own life, he told them simply that legacy was never something inherited through a family name or built through careful appearances. It was something earned, one honest day at a time, by choosing, again and again, the people who actually deserved to be chosen. Looking back on the entire story now, from the university library where 2 20-year-olds first sat across a table from each other, to the ballroom doorway where 3 children finally met the father they had spent years wondering about, it becomes clear that very little of what happened followed the plan either family originally intended. Eleanor had spent years believing that legacy meant protecting a reputation at any cost, only to learn, far later than she would have liked, that the reputation she protected so carefully had nearly cost her the very family she claimed to be preserving. Ryan had spent years believing that silence in the face of his mother's cruelty was simply loyalty, only to discover that real loyalty required the far harder work of standing beside the people he loved, even when it meant disappointing the one person he had spent his entire life trying to please. Grace, more than anyone else in the story, had to learn the hardest lesson of all, that asking for help was not a weakness to be overcome through sheer willpower, but a strength most people spend their entire lives too proud to practice. It was Daniel who taught her that lesson, patiently, and without ever making her feel indebted for learning it. And it was her children, in the end, who taught every adult around them the simplest truth the entire story eventually rested on, that a family is built not through legacy, reputation, or careful planning, but through the people willing to keep showing up, day after ordinary day, long after the difficult moments that first brought them together have quietly faded into the past.